Magnus Carlsen just unleashed his true form in the Blitz segment of the Grand Chess Tour 2025. It was a disappointing performance by Magnus in the rapid section, but now he's back in the business. In this video, I'm going to completely break down the games he played between Gukesh, Nodirbek and Praggnanandhaa in the most easiest manner, because as I always say, if you really want to improve your chess, just like Magnus did, you need to understand, you need to analyze the games of very top players. And here I am. I don't want to waste any further time. Make sure to watch the complete video till the end and let's begin. Magnus first playing against Gukesh. A very thrilling game it's going to be. First of all, Magnus gave Gukesh the handicap of 15 seconds as he came late. So 1 e4 by Magnus, we have e5 by Gukesh, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. We have the royal pace by Magnus, and now we have knight to f6 by Gukesh, also known as the Berlin defense. A very solid opening to play with black. And now we have d3 by Magnus. He's looking for a fight, of course, because he has lost 2 games in a row against Gukesh. So definitely he must be looking for his revenge. We have bishop to c5 by Gukesh. And now we have the move knight to c3. First of all, a move that comes into my mind is what after knight bishop cross c6 takes, and can I just take the pawn on e5 because the e4 pawn is well protected by the d pawn. But here black is simply having queen to d4, threatening a mate and also capturing the knight. White can play bishop e3 after takes d4, saying that okay, now I'm also attacking your one of the piece. But here black can simply chop off the pawn on e4, and after takes queen g2, rook f1, bishop h3, the game is over. Black is winning. That's why bishop cross c6 is not a good move. And we have the move knight to c3. And now we have castle by Gukesh. And now bishop cross c6, d cross c6, and now bishop to e3. Now it looks like, can we take the pawn on e5 now? Yeah, like you should not take really the pawn on e5 in this position, because not because of queen d4 first of all, because after bishop e3 queen takes d4. You see now the e4 pawn is defended by the knight, so it's not the best way. Instead, at the place of playing the move queen d4, you can simply chop off the pawn on f2 with the bishop. After king f2, queen d4 check, you can simply chop off the knight on e5, and I believe black position is pretty fine. White's castling has been broken up, and it's opposite color bishop, maybe the game would end in a draw. So going back, that's the reason Magnus did not took the pawn on e5 and he played the move bishop to e3. You must be thinking the most flexible move should be to castle up in this position, right? Yeah, that's the most flexible move in this position, and there's nothing wrong in this move. But Magnus, like if he castles up bishop g4, and the game is going to be continued as normal as possible, or maybe just bishop d6 and bishop g4 first protecting the pawn. But as I said, Magnus, it's a blitz game. It's a 5 minutes plus 2 second increment. He does not really want to play some simple solid chess. Bishop e3 by Magnus, and now we have the move bishop to d6. If you take on e3 after takes, you see engine says it's an equal position, but I believe after castle up, f file is opened up, e5 pawn is weak, queen e1, queen g3. I believe it's very easy to play with the white pieces, even knight e2, knight g3, knight f5. Despite engine saying it's equal, practically speaking, it's already better for white. It's much easier to play with white. So we have bishop d6 protecting the pawn on e5, and now bishop to g5 by Magnus, pinning up the knight. And now we have the move h6 by Gukesh. The bishop drops back, and now Gukesh hesitantly played the move bishop to g4, which I believe. Bishop g4 is already not a good move in this position, because we simply have the move h3. At the place of bishop g4, he should have played just rook e8, just trying to wait. He can play bishop f8, queen d6, and somehow just trying to wait, not really committing the bishop on c8 yet, because after bishop g4, we have h3. And now the main problem here is Magnus has not really castled up yet. So after bishop h5, we simply have g4. And after bishop g6, rook g1, you guys can already understand that white is launching some heavy attacks. Knight e2, knight g3, maybe queen d2, I can castle up. The moment I throw in g5 in the position, black is already collapsing, and it's already very hard to play with black. It's a blitz game, and you are facing Magnus. So that's the reason Gukesh is not really having much choice but to take, and he played the move bishop e7 just quickly with the intention of pulling the knight back, trading off the bishops, and maybe that's a draw. That's indeed a draw. But Magnus does not really want a draw, so he decides to take on f6 with the bishop. Why did he took on f6? Because he wanted to keep some imbalance in the position. Here we have knight versus bishop. And now we are going to see some real class by Magnus Carlsen. Why is he known as the god of chess? We have first g3. First, Magnus is just putting the pawns on the dark squares, trying to limit the bishop on f6. That's exactly what happened. And now bishop e7, and now we have the move short castle by Magnus. I believe he could have simply played the move long castle, and it's much better. Just g4, g5 coming in, putting the rook on g1, and it would have been much better. But I believe Magnus was a bit concerned that maybe Gukesh can also launch some double side attack, like on attacking on the queen side, and the position could be a bit double-edged. He did not want this. He did not want to take any risk. He simply castled up on the same side as Gukesh. And now we have bishop to c5 by Gukesh. A move that comes in my mind is to play the move f5, pushing the pawn in the king's side, trying to open up the rook. But after takes 6, just queen g4, and you see it looks like the f2 pawn is a bit soft after bishop c5, but thanks to white's okay, first of all there is queen c4 check and you lose the bishop, but despite that, after bishop c5 I can just play knight e4. I'm just attacking the bishop. The knight can never be attacked by any of the pawns, and you see it's already much easier to play with white. Black is having an isolated pawn, which is going to be a long-term weakness, and white is already better. So that's the reason Gukesh first decided to play the move bishop c5, just trying to improve the bishop. And now we have king g2 by Magnus. Typical Magnus style, just improving the king. Maybe the rook can come in on the king side. We have bishop to d4 by Gukesh. His idea is pretty clear. He wants to take the knight somehow, and the game would eventually end in a draw then. But Magnus simply played the move knight to e2. You can't really take the pawn on b2 because after rook b1, you lose the pawn on b7. And now Gukesh just played the move bishop b6. I think bishop b6 is kind of an unnecessary move by Gukesh. I understand that it's a Blitz game, but still bishop b6 is an unnecessary move. Of course, if Magnus takes, Gukesh must be happy, but maybe Gukesh is a bit concerned with c3, d4 in the position. He played the move bishop to b6. And now finally we have g3 by Magnus. Magnus's idea is pretty clear. He wants to play knight g3, knight f5, putting some pressure on the king side and maybe just getting some sort of a break, and white is better. Like, it's much easier to play with white. We have g6 by Gukesh, just taking control of the f5 square. Knight to g3, and now we have the move queen to e7 by Gukesh. So during the game, Garry Kasparov, the former world champion, came in an interview and he said in this position that Gukesh should have played the move bishop to c5. Why? Because the idea is to simply put the bishop on e7. For example, after rook h1, bishop e7, you see it looks like white is having two breaks in the position, but first of all, after h5, black can just play bishop g5. And the bishop is nicely placed, bishop f4 is coming up, and black king is absolutely safe in the position. And if just g5, black can just block the position with h5, and black is now having an absolutely fine position, even slightly better. So I believe bishop c5 would have been much better, putting the bishop on e7, because currently the bishop on b6 is absolutely doing nothing. We have the move queen to e7 by Gukesh, and now just rook h1, rook to d8, a4 by Magnus with the intention of playing a5. We have a5 by Gukesh, queen e2, queen d2, attacking the pawn on h6. So we have king g7, h5, and now after h5, it's a very nice move. You can't push, you can't take because of knight check, and you lose the queen. So we have the move queen to g5 by Gukesh, because I just want to take and play the move queen h6. The game is over. And if you take with the rook, I'm just having knight f5 check, and that's it. So queen g5, Gukesh trying to trade off the queen. And you see, if you would have had the bishop instead of queen, you could have simply played bishop g5, and the position is absolutely fine. But after queen g5 takes, we have knight to f1 by Magnus. Just a pure knight versus bishop domination now. If you take on g6, it's not a great idea, because now black is having some great counterplay despite having double pawns on the g5. So we have knight f1, rook f6, just f3, not allowing some rook f2 ideas. Rook f4, takes, rook h3, just defending the pawn. And now engine says it's an even position, but white is slightly better, because white's idea is very clear. Just knight d2, get the other rook to h1, just penetrate. The d2 knight is already protecting the f3 square, and white is just winning. So Gukesh decided to play the move rook h8, and now you can see the bar has been raised up for the white side. We just have a rook trade, and now just knight to d2. Just knight c4, and the pawn on e5 is just losing. So rook f6 go back, knight c4, rook e6 defending the pawn, and now just rook b1 with the intention of opening up the position with b4, takes checks, a5, capturing b7, and the game is over. So we have c5 by Gukesh, and just check, and just king f2 with the idea of playing the move king e2, king d2, king c3, knight d2, knight b3, king c4, and capturing the pawn on c5, and the game is over. Basically, it's a complete one-sided game. So we have bishop a7 by Gukesh, giving up the pawn on a5, and now playing the move c4 check. Now if rook a6, attacking the knight and the pawn, now we simply have knight b7, rook takes the pawn, and now just king e2. Rook b4, attacking the knight and the pawn, the knight can go back, just king d2, and you see the bishop is actually dead. The pawns are on the dark square, which kind of limits their own bishop, and white is completely winning. Just rook a2, knight c4, get the other rook in, and the game is over. Believe me, there are lots of weakness, and Magnus can easily win the position. Instead, we have the move c4 check, king e2, takes checks, check, king c4, just taking the pawn on b7, pushing the pawn, and now Magnus is a pawn up with an open d file, which is completely winning for him. A check, the king goes back, rook goes to d3, just not allowing rook to c3. c3, rook goes, and Magnus simply took the pawn on c7. Magnus is 2 pawns up, 2 pawns are passed pawn. So in this position, Gukesh decided to resign the game, and Magnus simply won. So this is how Magnus simply showed his class, played an old man style chess, no tactics, just pure positional play, and he simply outplayed Gukesh. As you can see, just from an equal position was just so good, he simply outplayed Gukesh. So this was a thrilling game played by Magnus to beat Gukesh. Now let's jump into the game between Magnus versus Nodirbek. Okay, so now we have the game between Magnus versus Nodirbek. Magnus starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Bishop goes to b5, a6. Once again, we have the royal pace. Bishop a4, bishop c5. c3 with the intention of playing the move d4, and now we have the move knight e7 by Nodirbek. Basically, the idea is to generally for black is to put the knight on g6, which is considered one of the most solid setup to play with black. Castle, knight g6, and now d4 by Magnus. And after d4, you are having choice whether you want to take or whether you want to go back. Nodirbek decides to go back with bishop a7. Of course, if you try to take, you see Magnus is just having 2 pawns in the center. Both the pawn pushes are coming up, and white is already better. So that's why bishop a7, and now Magnus pushed the pawn to d5, attacking the knight. The knight has to go back, and now he played the move bishop to e3. A typical Magnus style move. If you take on e3, it looks like white is having double pawns, but now f4 square is covered by the pawn, so knight can never hop on f4. White is having the open f file once again, and you see it's a typical Magnus style position: queen e1, queen g3, knight d2, knight c4. The pawn is weak. White is already better in the practical perspective. So Nodirbek decides to play the move castle up, and now we have the move d6 by Magnus, already taking some initiative. After d6, we have the move knight to c6. Like at the place of knight c6, if black tries to capture on d6, Magnus can just first take the bishop on a7, because now the rook is a bit misplaced, and now just queen d6. And after queen d6, you see just black is not really having any play. The bishop is bad. The pawn is collapsing, and it's much easy to play with the white pieces. Black, it's a one-sided play, come on. So that's why we have the move knight to c6 by Nodirbek, but now we have the move c4 by Magnus. At the first glance, it looks like c4, it just weakens up the pawn, it just weakens up the square of d4 and b4 at the same time. But Magnus' thinking process is just so fast. His idea is pretty clear. He understands that d5 square is a very weak square for black. Why? Because eventually white is going to take the pawn on c7, and then white is just going to put the knight on d5. And if black takes it, white is still fine. White is still going to put the knight on d5. c4 with the intention of just knight c3, knight d5. And Magnus is just in form. We have bishop e3, fe3, takes, and now just first playing knight c3, not hurrying up to capture the pawn on d6, because even if black tries to defend it with the queen, just knight d5, you move the queen, you lose an exchange, it's over. In the game, we had the move b5. Why b5? Why sacrificing a pawn? You see, in this position, just try to think, just try to pause the video and try to understand. Black is not really having any play in the position. The bishop is bad, pawns are doubled up, you can't really achieve any break in the center. Black is actually having absolutely zero play in this position. Engine says black can play queen b6, queen d2, and just knight e7. But just try to understand the position. Black is not really having any play in the position. The bishop is bad, the rook is bad, the knight is bad, everything is bad. And that's it. Like, it's complete one-sided play. Magnus can simply crush this position with the white pieces because black is having absolutely zero play. That's why Nodirbek decides to sacrifice a pawn and try to open up the position. But now Magnus is just a pawn up. Queen b8. Thanks for trading of the queens. Now Magnus, now you are playing the endgame against the endgame god. We have rook f2 first defending the b2 pawn. Knight goes back, rook d1, f6, b3. And now we have the move rook a7 by Nodirbek. I believe he should have been a bit more proactive in the position by playing the move knight b4, putting some pressure, not allowing Magnus to get some easy play in the position. Just putting some pressure at least. He played rook a7, just giving a free hand to Magnus. Magnus just improved his knight, both the knights, and now just knight d6. Just not trading off the knights yet, because then the position would be a bit draw. So keeping both the knights in the position, and now starting to push his both passed pawns, which is a great idea. Knight b7, knight b5, knight goes to c3, pushing other pawn on a4, a5, rook b2, h4, just giving up the pawn because these pawns is not really playing in the position. White's main active asset is the pawn on the a file and the pawn on b4. So rook c1 taking control of the c file, h5, knight c7, a6, knight over here. It's completely losing. Just b5, b6 is also coming up. Knight c5 takes, and now rook to a1, threatening to make a queen. You have to play rook a7, but now I can just even take. I can even play the move rook b7. I can even push the pawn. Everything is winning. So that's the reason after rook a1, Nodirbek decides to resign the game. Magnus is still having 1 minute 50 seconds on his clock, and Nodirbek just 25 seconds. This just shows Magnus's chess talent, and his instincts are so powerful in a blitz game. So this was the game between Magnus versus Nodirbek. Now let's move on to the final game. Magnus versus Praggnanandhaa. Okay, so now we have one more thriller battle between Pragg versus Magnus. This time, Magnus is playing with black. Pragg is playing with white. We have the move pawn b3 by Pragg. e5, bishop b2, knight to c6, e3, g6, c4. Bishop g7, knight f3, knight e7, d4. And now we have takes, and now we have the move knight cross d4. Now many of the beginners or club level players would simply capture with the pawn. Why? Capturing towards the center makes sense. Yeah, you can definitely capture the pawn in the center, but to be true, after just ed4, you see the bishop is kind of blocked by his own pawn. Black can just play the move d5, castle up, and after taking on c4, you see the d4 pawn is having so much pressure. I can even play knight f5. It's not a great idea to capture with the pawn. That's why if you want to keep this bishop a good bishop, you must take with the knight, and that's exactly what Pragg did. We have castle, bishop e2, knight takes, bishop takes. Once again, not capturing with the pawn, because he realizes the bishop would simply be a bad piece. Bishop d4, queen d4, d5, striking in the center. We have the move knight to c3. If he takes, Magnus can just capture it back with the queen. The position is even. He played the move knight c3, takes, and now first Pragg decides to trade off the queen, and now bishop c4. The position is like equalish, material is equal, the position is absolutely equal. Now knight to f5 and now king e2. I prefer white a slight better in this position because the king is much active compared to the black king. We have knight goes back, bishop goes back, bishop e6, rook d1, f5, getting all the pieces into the game with rook c1. Sorry about that. And now we have c6, and now we have h4 by Pragg. Finally getting all his pieces into the game and now pushing his side pawn. King f7, h5. Taking the pawn is not a great idea because now these pawns are simply a weakness after rook h1. It's not a great idea. So that's why Magnus decides to play king f6, takes, and now just rook h1. Knight goes over here, rook goes to d1. Rook d7 by Magnus is just trying to double up the rooks on the d file. Bishop c2. We have a rook trade. Rook goes to h8, and now we have the move f4 by Pragg. Just trying to grab some space on the king side, and now we have the move g5 by Magnus, trying to open up the position. Capturing is not a great idea because after king g5, you see the king is somehow getting active. Knight is coming to e5, and it's a good idea for black. Like, it's much easier to play with black. So instead we have the move king f3 by Pragg, trying to activate his king as well, and now we have the move g cross f4. If you try to push, it's not a great idea because after king g3, I can strike in the center with e4, and the moment I strike with e4, the g pawn would eventually become a bit weak, and then white can already start pushing the pawns on the king side. So that's the idea. Magnus decided to took and played the move a5. Magnus trying to generate his own play on the queen side as he's having 3 versus 2 majority, which is a great idea. Bishop d3, b5, king f2, a4, and now you have the move b4 by Pragg. The best move is to take, but I believe after takes, black can push the pawn, sacking a pawn, and now just playing the move like black can just take the pawn on a2, which is absolutely fine. The b pawn is very strong. Or black can just push the pawn to c5. Pushing both the pawns, c4 is coming up, and I believe it's already very hard to play with the white pieces, despite being a pawn up. So it's a great idea played by Magnus, which is sacrificing a pawn. Pragg understands the position and he pushed the pawn to b4. We have a3 by Magnus, and now already the a3 pawn looks a very strong pawn for Magnus. We have bishop e2, rook goes to c8, trying to push the pawn to c5, getting a break, and then starting to generate some play on the queen side with b4, b3. Pragg played rook d2, king e7, bishop f3, knight to d6, knight e2. Finally, we have a break, takes, and now knight to d4. After knight d4, it looks a bit complex position. The knight is jumping around, maybe knight c6, maybe rook e2, attacking the bishop, maybe knight cross e6 can happen. Many things are happening up, so Magnus plays once a good move, bishop to c4, defending the pawn, defending the bishop, everything is well defended. We have a check, and the knight goes to b4. Now, basically not allowing black to push his pawn by putting the knight on b4. We have king e6, rook c2, the rook goes back, and now rook c3. And after rook c3, Magnus just realized the pawn is hanging. He can't even play rook a8 defending the pawn because the bishop can simply capture the rook. So he's just losing the pawn, so Magnus decides to play rook d8, which was a bad move. In this position, he was having the opportunity to play the move knight to e4 check, attacking the rook and the king. So it would have been bishop takes, pawn takes, and after rook takes, just king f5, g3, just rook h8. I believe black is having a bit of a counterplay, the pawn is strong, and I believe the game, Magnus can at least hold this position. That's what my assessment is. But he played the move rook d8, and after takes, Magnus was still having the opportunity to give a check, but he played the move rook over here, and now Pragg just played the move rook a6, pushed the pawn, and now activated his king. White is just winning. Rook e1, check, and now knight over here, and now Pragg should have played knight b4. Just knight b4, get the rook, get the king, slowly get the bishop, maybe just take over here, and Pragg is just winning. But he played the move rook to a6. Pragg missed that Magnus can push the pawn to b4 now, attacking the rook. And now we have rook b6 takes, and now the position is even. But now you see the black's pawn is very strong, just 2 squares away from being a queen. We have knight to b4, Pragg trying to stop the queen. We have king to over here because the knight was also hanging. So king e7, and now we have the move bishop to d5, which was a blunder. Pragg should have simply sacrificed the rook for the knight by capturing 2 minor pieces, and now this is a draw. This is a well draw. You can play king b3 and the game would end in a draw. But instead, Pragg played the move bishop d5, trying to trade off the bishop. But black can just play the move a2, and that's winning. You have to take, or else I can make a queen. The moment you take, I can give a check, and I can capture the bishop. The bishop is defended by the knight, so you have to move the king, and I can just capture the piece, and I'm just a piece up, and that's winning. But Magnus missed the move, and he played the move rook to d1 check. And now after rook d1 check, white can just play king c5 with the intention of just capturing the bishop. I would be a piece up. If you take, I can just take. And that's it. That's equal position. But Pragg played the move king e5. And now, you see, now, if you take, I can just capture with the knight. So Magnus just gave a check another and just push the pawn to a2. That's it. And now I want to make a queen. That's it. We have knight a2, and now we have a check, and he just took the bishop. That's it. He just took the bishop. Because I'm just going to make a queen. You have to take the pawn. The moment you take the pawn, I can give a check, I can take the bishop, and now we have knight c3 attacking the rook and the bishop, but knight check attacking the king and the rook. Check, he took the rook, captured the pawn, king e3, and now we have knight to d5 check, forcing a knight trade, and now this is just a winning endgame for Magnus. So that's the reason after knight d5, the moment Magnus played knight d5, Pragg decides to resign the game, and Magnus won. Magnus is having the chess talent. You can understand, what do you mean by chess talent, you ask me? I would say the player who is having less time on his clock and he can play moves by all his instincts. it displays his chess talent. I believe Gukesh is not really having, like, many of the viewers are going to hate me for this, but I think it's a fact. Like Gukesh, Caruana Fabiano is not really having the chess talent. They can't really. They are having good calculation, but they are not really having good instincts. That's what I believe. Magnus, despite being on low time, he's having the chess talent. He can play, like, he can completely rely on his instincts and play the best moves in the position. Whereas Gukesh and Fabi is not really having a good tournament in the Blitz section of the Grand Chess 2. That's my assessment is. So yeah, these were the 3 games. I hope you guys enjoyed the game. You guys learned it, and you guys must have learned something. Yeah. So yeah, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, share, and smash that subscribe button. I'm going to see you in the next one. Thank you for watching, and bye bye.